It is my pleasure to chair this panel with Michelle Grattan, Erik Jensen and Chris Graham. I shall briefly introduce each participant before leading off a discussion about the media industry's most pressing issues. Michelle Grattan AO is one of Australia's most respected and awarded political journalists. She has been a member of the Canberra Parliamentary Press Gallery for more than 40 years and is currently Chief Political Correspondent for The Conversation. Erik Jensen is the founding editor of The Saturday Paper. He has won the Walkley Award for Young Print Journalist of the Year and the United Nations Media Peace Award, and is the author of Acute Misfortune, The Life and Death of Adam Cullen. Chris Graham is the owner and editor of New Matilda. He was the associate producer on John Pilger's Utopia and is the former managing editor and founder of Tracker magazine and the National Indigenous Times. I'm going to begin by making some preliminary remarks about a companion to the Australian media. It's the first such book about the media and communications in Australia, with both a historical and contemporary focus. It ranges from 1803, with the publication of Australia's first newspaper, the Sydney Gazette, to the 1830s, with the publication of the first Indigenous newspaper, the Flinders Island Chronicle, right up to mobile and portable media and to zines. Ultimately, it presents a picture of the media in Australia in the second half of 2014, at a time of significant and perhaps unprecedented disruption, which we'll be touching on tonight. The vital statistics, which Chris actually asked me for before, the book is 415,000 words. It has 479 entries, contributed by 298 people, industry practitioners, academics and independent scholars. The entries range on some topics that may be of interest to our panellists given their backgrounds: the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery, the National Indigenous Times, the Media Peace Awards, the Walkley Awards, and The Legend of Michelle Herself by Louise North. By now, we're accustomed to hearing all kinds of predictions about the death of the media giant. This evening, we're going to consider what David might be without Goliath. The companion traces the biggest being Murdoch, Packer, Syme and Fairfax, and small, what we might call startups now, some of which died, some of which survived and thrived. So we have about 40 minutes to have a discussion with the panel about the relationship between big and small media in Australia. And then at 7 o'clock, we'll open the floor, the microphone, to an opportunity for 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. So I thought I might begin by asking Michelle about what she sees as the relationship now between mainstream and smaller media outlets, and what might Australia's media landscape look without its biggest players.
I think we've seen a paradox, really, in the development of the media in the last few years. What we're seeing is more concentration of reporting, particularly in the mainstream media, with, for example, Fairfax going from having, say, 3 political correspondents for The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Canberra Times, to having a political correspondent whose material goes into all 3 papers. Now, of course, they have more than one person writing politics, but in terms of the coverage, that tends to shrink the voices. So you might get a story in the Sydney Morning Herald and think, well, I wonder what The Age take is on this, The Age correspondent's take, and you find that it's the same person. And this is obviously important when you especially when you have issues of leadership, conflict within parties and so on. But it's important all the time. So you have this concentration happening, and at the same time, of course, you've had an increase in diversity through the whole new media scene. Now, some people, for example, Malcolm Turnbull, would say that arguments about concentration, whether of ownership or reporting resources in the mainstream media, are less important these days because of the diversity of voices we've got through the net. I think this is really a false argument, because you also have the phenomenon of the traditional media still having the political clout as well, indeed, as the reporting resources compared to the new media. And in terms of political clout, you just have to see the politicians' reaction and the way that stories unfold during the day. The old media still, on the whole, sets the political agenda to the extent that the media does set the agenda. And while there are exceptions, of course, when big stories are broken in new media, I think that that paradigm of the old media being the most important still is the case and has to be recognised. And the other point is that the mainstream media also still has, albeit diminished, but still has the reporting resources. The new media has relatively few resources and a lot of opinion, some reporting and some stories, significant stories broken, but nevertheless the resources compared to the old traditional media are really very limited indeed for journalism that's breaking news, that's getting out facts. So I think that the media scene at the moment is one that has a lot of problems for the future, and while the new media provides some hope, it does not provide answers, and we should still be very aware of the relativities in power terms.
Chris or Erik, would you like to jump in here, given your involvement with some of those new, smaller outlets?
Yeah, look, I unfortunately agree with everything you just said, Michelle. I mean, if you don't know New Matilda, we're a tiny outfit. We've got 3 full-time staff, no official editor, that's me, but I have another job. And it's very difficult for us sometimes to break through. We'll sometimes break a big story, and that will obviously cut through. And a lot of our business model really is structured around making sure that whatever we break gets picked up by the traditional old media. But it can be very difficult, and by way of example, Max Chalmers, one of our reporters, broke a great story a few weeks ago based on leaked transcripts of the Moss Review into detention on Nauru. It was an amazing story, a genuine scoop, and it went absolutely nowhere. We got probably 60,000 reads on the New Matilda website, but the story didn't really go anywhere. And I was mentioning at the back, the highest story we've ever had rated was this Tuesday, or this Monday, about Samantha Armitage, the presenter on Sunrise, who made a racist faux pas. Now, it took me about 5 minutes to write that story. It was pap and rubbish, to be frank. And it was just a kind of, well, look at this crap. And that's the story that rated off the charts. So it's an enduring frustration for us. But to answer your original question, I think if old big media disappeared, then the media landscape, from my perspective, would be probably more accountable and more ethical, which, you know, I'm clearly no fan of big media.
But how would you resource that? That's the key question, isn't it?
Well, it is, and how you make money from media is literally the million-dollar question, and it's the question that is posed for New Matilda at the moment. We're breaking even without having to pay editors' wages, but which are not that flash anyway, let's be honest. But yeah, it is the million-dollar question, and I see the industry as in a bit of a state of flux at the moment, but I'm quite optimistic about it, and I've always believed, I've been in print 25 years, but I've always believed online media is about niche media. It's about small, nimble media, exploiting a particular market. And in the case of New Matilda, and in the case of Saturday paper, even though it's print, that market is informed readers who want better quality journalism, and that suits my ethics. So I think there's a genuine, clear space for good quality investigative journalism. But again, well, I could be wrong, and my bankruptcy in 2 or 3 years might prove it.
I think we're talking there, I suppose, about the perverse symbiosis of large old media and new media, and that is, I think Australia would be, I disagree with Chris somewhat on one of those issues. I think Australia would be vastly worse off if News and Fairfax were not publishing and did not have newsrooms that, while not anywhere near as well resourced as they once were, are still better resourced than the newsrooms of, I think, probably any startup in the country. And that goes even for the Guardian, who are a well-resourced organisation. And so, you know, startup media and new media is very dependent on those newsrooms, and yet I think takes stories that are broken there and turns them into the kind of serious ethical journalism you're talking about, the sort of long-form, considered and you know, really well conceived of and ultimately, I hope, you know, accurate journalism that sometimes gets left by the wayside in those big newsrooms. The perversity of that symbiosis comes when those large newsrooms are very nervous about new media, and so when a good story breaks, like Max's story, even though they would recognise the decency of that story, they'd be loath to report it. And if they were to report it, they'd be very loath to say that it came from New Matilda in the first instance.
Absolutely. In fact, we leaked them the leaked transcripts and they still didn't report it.
Yeah. Whereas, you know, in the Saturday paper, I'm very happy to say in a story if it was broken initially in the Sydney Morning Herald, because it seems only decent to properly report where something came from. And it's not new that those stories come from those newsrooms. You know, it's historically those big broadsheets set the news agenda first thing in the morning that was picked up by breakfast radio and you know, ultimately by television the following evening, and that's where you would often get perhaps the interviews that added the potency that you weren't given as a print reporter because it wasn't worth answering your call, but it finally became worth doing the interview the following evening. And that cycle has run forever, and that cycle is still running with new players running alongside it. And I think both for new players and for major news organisations, there will eventually be a greater understanding of where they sit in a kind of, and I hate the word ecosystem for media, but it's true that one exists, that, you know, where once someone got all of their news from a single paper and so it made sense for that paper to, say, syndicate content from the New York Times, no one is getting their news from a single source anymore. And the sooner that big news organisations realised that, I think the better journalism in the country would be.
And if we continue with this sort of ecosystem analogy, it's very much, it seems, a symbiotic relationship between the big and the small media, that the small media generally does need to rely on some of the journalism that is actually done and still able to be funded by the big media. But papers such as yours, Erik, can offer more long-form reflective pieces on the stories that may actually have been, you know, published in Fairfax or News, but you can also break stories at the same time.
We're the suckerfish on the great white sharks.
I like to think of myself as a tick bird, really. I prefer, you know, they're a graceful creature.
I prefer tuna or a marlin. But
you were giving me a very strange look, and I wondered what you were going to say.
Yeah,
but
it is symbolic.
The other aspect of that, I suppose, is the cycle has become such for those major news organisations that the apparatus that once demanded and you know, ensured the quality of their journalism has been broken apart by absolute panic at the speed of the internet and a belief that people wanted their news to be as fast as possible. And I think even in the print pages of those papers, they're chasing you know, an audience and a news cycle that is always going to be faster than their pages. A big part of why we launched the Saturday paper was to say, you know, we can jam the gears of that news cycle. We don't have to be victims to that news cycle, and audiences will wait around not for the news to be first, but for the news to be best. And that's, you know, that's always been a sort of a seesaw in journalism.
They're also chasing, I think, both speed of turnover but also number of hits.
Yep.
And this is taking some sites of the mainstream media very much down market.
Yeah, look at
There's
the
no
Daily
doubt about
Mail.
this,
I mean,
because what they're desperate to do is to move things online and to get enough hits to be able to justify advertising fees and to attract advertising. And also one of the problems, which is diminishing the papers, is that the papers themselves become a sort of afterthought to this process. So you get a lot of reverse publishing, for example, a story that's been up for a few hours on the website will be put into the paper. So it becomes very much stale news by the morning.
yeah.
But I think one of the great straw men in newsrooms has been the idea that trash is the only thing that succeeds online. And this had been a view in newsrooms that you know, the further down market you took your websites, the larger their audiences would be. And that's somewhat true, but the audiences weren't going to be valuable anymore. And another sort of, you know, the Saturday paper is, I think, a happy experiment in how to look at both print papers and websites. The strangest thing at the Saturday paper that we've experienced in the last year of running is that the better and more serious a story is, the better it does online. And the longer a story is, the better it does online. And, you know, there's this H.L. Mencken thing that, you know, no one went broke underestimating the intelligence of the American people. It's quite the opposite, I think. You know, no one's going to go bust overestimating the sophistication of Australian readers. We have a very bright, informed readership who were largely being forgotten. But profitably niche. I mean, I don't think the idea this like there will no longer be the monolithic paper that is the only thing you read and your only source of news. There will no longer be a monolithic audience that is valuable to advertisers. Our
experience has been exactly what Erik's talking about, because when we break frankly, the horseshit story about Samantha Armitage, we got over 100,000 reads on that story alone. But we got very few subscriptions from that story, virtually none. But when we broke a good investigative story about a racist professor in Sydney, Barry Spur, we were getting subscriptions for a month from that story, and probably still are from people who remember that story. So, but Michelle's right, it is niche. And from New Matilda's perspective, we actually announced about 2 weeks ago, we're chasing 10,000 subscribers in the month of May. Now, 10,000 is a tiny subscription base, but for a small publishing organisation like ours, that's $1 million in revenue. And $1 million in revenue to a small organisation can buy a lot of really good journalism. I must admit, I started at the Herald as a copy boy. I was about to say I don't know what they spend their money on. I do know what they spend their money on, and it's mostly not journalists and good journalism. When I was at the Herald, we were laughing about this out the back, when I was at the Herald during the Olympics, they hired the Orient Hotel, a 3-level hotel in Sydney for 3 weeks, and put bands on every night on 2 different levels. I don't know how they've burned so much cash, the Herald, but I know from working in small publishing, we can make $1 million go a hell of a lot further than Fairfax or News ever does, which is a good reason why you should give us $1 million if you didn't pick up my sales pitch.
And I think my publisher would be very pleased to sell 10,000 copies of this book about the Australian media.
What's that book called again?
Show and Tell.
There you go.
Erik, you referred to some of your really good stories actually getting the most hits or the most readership online and I think you said in print as well. But I know that you also share a concern, I think, with Erik about the giants ignoring some of the stories that you actually break.
Yeah, there was a concern held by a lot of people in journalism when the internet started to fragment news organisations and when social media became a large driver of traffic. And that concern was that people would find themselves in little ghettos that resembled their own ideas, and that everything would become niche and people would become less informed as a result of those niches. I think the opposite is somewhat true. Social media, which was once very much a personal thing, has really become an aggregator of news. And I suspect people are exposed to more news now than what they might previously have been, and more news outlets, more different kinds of views. But the other thing that does is it demands that a story captivate a reader to be shared. As a news organisation, we're no longer allowed, well, we are not relying on News in Fairfax to give leverage to our stories because we know that they will largely ignore them. We are relying on making the stories as good as they can be to ensure that an audience finds them, and that audience, once finding them, shares them and makes, does the work that large news organisations might once have done. So I'm not so much worried about the way in which big news organisations ignore small ones. I think what we lose if we lose those big news organisations is their news-breaking capability. And that's not just about their resourcing, that's about having a hive mind of talented people in one place, all sharing their expertise. And that helps on every story as it's breaking to have expertise around it. But it also helps to produce journalists. I mean, I don't think anyone on the stage tonight would be a journalist without the training they received in big news organisations. I think one of the most worrying things that troubles me at the Saturday paper is that we're not large enough a news organisation to offer the kind of mentoring to young reporters that I received at the Sydney Morning Herald, or that Chris, you might have received, or Michelle, that you would have received at one point.
At the pub, mostly, down the road.
Yeah, it doesn't have to happen in the newsroom, but it's a huge thing that would be lost if those newsrooms are no longer producing journalists.
This critical mass question is quite an important one, and often overlooked. And one of the problems at the moment with getting the critical mass is that these newsrooms in the main organisations are diminishing, and people are being forced, obviously, to do a hell of a lot more in quite short times. And so I'm not saying people in the past were idle or should be idle, but there is a balance here, and if people are running around like ants in their tasks, then there is less time, I think, for both mentoring younger journalists, and there are fewer younger journalists being brought in anyway, but also for throwing around ideas, for brainstorming issues, and for interacting with each other. And I notice, being a lone operator in Canberra for The Conversation, for example, you are very aware of not having an economics correspondent to say, to ask what do these figures mean, or someone who knows about superannuation in the same office to talk to, and so on. And that's just one problem of being a small organisation or a lone operator, but there is this problem even in the big organisations of having less time, fewer people, less specialisation, fewer rounds people, all of which makes for once over likely.
One of the things, Erik, you alluded to a short time ago was this not relying on the Herald. And New Matilda, and when I was at the National Indigenous Times, we were pretty accomplished at packaging a story to get it into the mainstream media, because we knew that on an Aboriginal affairs story, unless you got it picked up by big media, you were just preaching to the converted, and if you were passionate about the story, you would never get an end result. It was genuine activist/campaign journalism. You don't have to do that as much these days. It still helps enormously, but the problem with it is, I see down the track, is Facebook and Twitter. Their power is growing, and as a small publisher, the thing that makes me most nervous about the future of my business is that we will be so reliant on two massive corporations in America for the traffic to our website, because at the moment, about 80% of our traffic comes through social media. BuzzFeed, for example, don't even worry about how their front page looks, because most of the traffic comes through the story pages via social media. And that is a massive issue for small publishers, is what happens in a year's time, or even next week, if Facebook or Twitter change the rules, because they control the method of delivery. And even if they don't change the rules, what happens if they change the equations? And suddenly a story might be deemed too negative or too fringe, which describes almost everything I write, and it's not going to get it's going to get far less traction. And suddenly my business model is A, out the window, and B, has been reliant on something that I can't control. It's terrifying as a publisher.
Michelle, did you feel pressure to go on Twitter? Were you on Twitter before you joined the conversation?
Yes, I was.
You were, right.
I
so
was.
it wasn't an expectation of the conversation. You were
no,
already
it wasn't. But I must say my attitude was initially when I was on Twitter that on the whole you didn't promote your own stories, that this was a bit of an indulgence.
Right.
I thought.
Old school.
It was old school, and I've become new school. And now I do regularly put out my own stories there because it is a way of, alerting people to them, I guess, and to the site. But certainly I think Twitter is vital in getting material out for the smaller outlets. There's no doubt about that. But it's heavily used by the big outlets too.
And there's no space for humility in the new media.
No. I've given that up a long time.
I've never had a problem with it anyway. But
I didn't find any humility in the old media.
You worked in big old media, though. In small old media, we were full of humility.
And Erik, when you tweet a link to a story in the Saturday paper, which I noticed that you do sort of maybe from the Friday or certainly from the Saturday, and that continues through the week until the next edition, is the link that you direct people to a free story, or is it behind a paywall? I say this as a subscriber because I never need to click on the links.
We have a metered paywall, so everyone can read 3 stories a week free. Right. And so if they've already read those 3, they won't be able to read the 4th for free through that tweet, and hopefully they will subscribe at that point. But there is a recalcitrant kind of 5,000 people who hit the paywall every week, who I'm sure are the same people and will be tracked down eventually.
Just don't mention the cache, Erik. Let's not discuss the cache. Yeah. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm not going to elaborate.
So, Michelle, you were in the old media, the big media for a long time. Do you feel now that you can still break stories writing for The Conversation instead of Fairfax, or is that perhaps not an appropriate question given that's not so much The Conversation's role, it's more sort of reflective and an opportunity to sort of disseminate expertise, or do you still see your role as a sort of traditional political editor? Well,
a traditional political correspondent, I guess, is trying to break stories, is reporting the news that's happening and is analysing and commenting on that news, and you try to do all those things. It's, I think, harder to break stories in the new media, other than people who are particularly strong in the news-breaking area, or sites that are particularly dedicated to that, because of resources, because people who want to get out stories, get them into the public arena, will very often be extremely strategic about this and will go to where the big audiences are, where the attention primarily is. Now, as I say, there are certain, obviously, niche areas of the new media where great stories are broken, and the one that Chris was mentioning earlier of those transcripts from the Moss inquiry was an instance of that. But I think people looking to get stories out still go to where the big audiences are.
And there's news breaking and there's newsrooms, which we started talking about a few minutes ago. And Erik, you noted that your, I think, major regret at the Saturday paper is your inability to really provide a great deal of sort of mentoring to staff, or to have interns or cadets, however you might refer to them. Would you like to, I think I'm right in saying that all of you began at Fairfax. Would you like to say something about your own experiences beginning at the Sydney Morning Herald and the sort of opportunities that you had there, and what may or may not be available to young journalists coming up, 10, 15 years later? I know you're not a terribly elderly person yourself, so can you sort of reflect on what's happening?
I think for any young reporter starting in a newsroom like that at the Sydney Morning Herald, I use an example because that's where I started. You find yourself working alongside the people who you'd read and respected for many years, and you find those people very keen to help you with the story that you're writing. Journalism is a hugely generous industry. I know we're complaining somewhat about the sort of tension that exists between you and old media, but in the main, and journalists are obviously keen to break stories and be better than each other, but they're also hugely generous, particularly with people who aren't going to break stories better than theirs for a while. So that's
I was going to say that if you didn't know.
Yeah. But not only would you have that assistance with the stories that you were working on, but there certainly, at least where I was sitting in the Herald, for the first sort of 5 years of my life in journalism, I got to sit next to David Meyer, and I thought that had made me very pessimistic. But then I launched a newspaper and realised that it made me kind of dangerously optimistic. But the first 2 hours of every day would be spent going through 4 newspapers and sort of picking them apart with a handful of journalists who are sitting around you, because that's sort of how the news day started, at least in the Sydney newsroom. And it was an invaluable thing for a young journalist to be able to see how senior journalists responded to stories, what they thought were good stories and were not good stories, what they thought about the treatment on certain things and where they were placed, and how a paper was looking, and all those things that sort of gathered in your mind as a young reporter somewhat by osmosis, simply being in that situation, which can't, I don't think, be easily taught, because these were very practical lessons. And so sort of looking at a newsroom like that, which is now probably a third the size of what it was when I was there, and still, I think, produces some very good young journalists, and certainly I think The Guardian is doing a very good job of producing good young journalists. But the luxury of that kind of education is probably behind us, and I don't think there is conversely a huge boom in communications courses at universities. I don't think those courses are producing anything like the skills that newsrooms were producing, and I haven't been able to see a way through fixing that problem. I mean, the Saturday paper, when it launched, set 2 purposes for itself. One was to find a financially sustainable model to do the kind of long-form journalism I thought was important and I thought newsrooms weren't doing anymore. The other was to offer to readers a kind of serious journalism that I thought they were getting less and less of. The third bit of that would be to try and produce brilliant new journalists, and it's the tricky bit that we haven't added at this stage. And yet I'm always quite amazed when young journalists produce stories. We work with them on the stories. The stories often aren't up to scratch when they arrive, but then after publication, they're very keen for detailed email feedback on what those stories were, and it sort of suggests that the need for that kind of hands-on mentoring remains, but obviously the mentoring itself doesn't.
I think there's another interesting thing about newsrooms of the past, perhaps the more ancient past, but there was more room for characters, for people who didn't fit the mould, who'd come in through various odd channels.
Parole,
whereas now
would be one of them.
Whereas now I think that because, perhaps changing times, more formal requirements for entry, better education requirements and so on, and the fact that there are fewer journalists, so people have to be recruited on the basis that they are likely to produce the goods to fit the mould and so on. You don't get that diversity in newsrooms that you might have, probably 50 years, 60 years ago, when quite a variety of experience ended up in the big news organisations, often quirky and
sometimes dangerous.
And produced just a diversity of journalism that I I think we don't get so much of.
I'm probably the last of that era, I suppose. I mean, I'm only 43, but I left school at 15, and I got my start at Fairfax as a copy boy, the lowly copy boy. I basically just sorted mail and got lunch for cranky journos, but I got a cadetship ultimately with a magazine company. But when I started in journalism, there were a lot more characters. We were in the old Jones Street building in Sydney, and Ross Gittins, the economics writer, used to be able to smoke cigars in his office, and he stunk out the entire 5th floor of Fairfax, and he got away with it for years because he's such a brilliant journalist. But back then, and Michelle, I'd love to hear your view on this. Back then, I considered journalism certainly not trendy. Somehow it's become fashionable. And it's left me behind somewhat, but it was considered a trade in my day to some extent. I mean, I did year 10 in school, that's as far as I went, and still managed to get into journalism. You really can't do that anymore, but I've never believed you need a TER of 98 to become a journalist. I don't necessarily, I mean, it's not a bad thing, but it shouldn't be a requirement, in my view. A capacity to speak to people and a capacity to be normal is quite handy.
And of course it's a trade that covers many skills and areas of expertise. You can't, it embraces the political writers, it embraces the people who are experts in sport and a whole lot of other areas of interest and expertise. And in a sense, while all these areas have common characteristics, they're also incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
I was pleased to be able to involve Ross Gittins. He wrote the entry on economics reporting for this, so he's still producing good work. And I might say, in relation to newsrooms producing sort of mavericks which corporate organisations may no longer have time for, I think I could say the same thing about the university sector. Working as an academic, it's increasingly difficult to not deliver according to the KPIs and not have, long lunches at the staff club, but still produce brilliant work and, fantastic postgraduate students, even if you haven't done supervisor training and such things.
At the Herald in the 80s, in the late 80s, lunch was always at the pub, and we had a dodgy old pool room, which we could go to in Sydney. When I went back during the Olympics, they had a full-time masseuse. They had this amazing cafeteria, and as I said, they hired a pub. So the industry has changed somewhat.
Yeah, I think to defend,
don't defend
the eccentricity of new media as well, and I think it's worth doing. So some of the best reporting that I've published has been first-time reporting, not just from young people, but also from people in their 40s who've suddenly decided they'd like to try their hand at journalism. And certainly my chief correspondent, who I think is Martin Mackenzie Murray, a really terrific writer, I met him in a bar about a week before we launched. He had no formal journalistic experience and was a speechwriter and has turned out to be a terrific hire. I think new media, if it seeks to, and I'm sure that you've hired some fairly eccentric people in your batch at New Matilda.
There's a guy at New Matilda who will not wear shoes.
Yeah, see, this kind of thing.
He will not wear shoes.
I remember turning up in the Herald newsroom and thinking what a terrific and gifted bunch of unemployable people I was working with. And I don't think journalism has been any different before to what it is now. The people attracted to journalism are people not necessarily attracted to careers. Virtually anyone in journalism could make more consistent and better money doing something else, but they don't because they love journalism. That's the thing that despite the kind of the troubles that buffet the industry, we will always have journalism because it is something that drives people.
But isn't a point here that the traditional media, like the universities, has become more conservative in hiring, and therefore you're more likely to get the same sort of people judged by the KPI criteria that you were talking about, coming in and working in that media, where the new media, because it needs talent and it isn't necessarily the first choice of people seeking a journalistic career, does go outside the box more, and it needs to fulfil its requirements. So I think there's potentially quite an interesting difference there. I just want to put in a footnote about Ross Gittins, whom I think is more eccentric in style than substance. He's always struck me as a very middle-of-the-road, very talented economist, but he's not out there on the fringes.
No. His cigars stink like shit, I can tell you.
Shoes, cigars, okay, but not, GDP and things of that nature. Very mainstream on that.
Yeah, I must admit, give me the new Matilda journo who doesn't wear shoes. And look, we did get a great hire. Tom Mitchell is our youngest reporter. He's only 20. He was dux of his high school, so obviously he's a smart bloke, but he hasn't been to university. He started, did a semester, didn't like it, and then sort of hung around like a bad smell, and eventually we gave him a job.
Would he get into the Australian? Would he get into the Fin Review?
I think he's got the stain of New Matilda, so he won't get near any of those.
Even
not
before,
without an armed escort.
Without the shoes.
Yeah, without shoes. Yeah, look, his reporting is outstanding. It's the best I've seen at someone. It was far better than mine at 20. And he's not going to come through the traditional university route. That's not to suggest that, Max Chalmers, who we've got, is an outstanding young reporter, did come via the university. But I actually find my experience is quite different to Erik's. I place a lot of emphasis at New Matilda on training and mentoring. And Amy Maguire, who's based in Canberra, our Aboriginal reporter, Amy's worked with me since she was 17, and I invested a lot of time and energy in Amy in the early days, and now I think she's par for par one of the best young reporters in the country. And I know what you're saying, Erik, about the capacity to provide training, but I see it as the most important thing we do, because if you New Matilda had the frustration of the Guardian poaching staff that New Matilda trained up, and that's actually how I came to own the publication, because Marnie Cordell, the previous owner, eventually threw her hands in the air when Adam Burton was poached by the Guardian. So I understand the constraints of small media and training, but I think it repays you tenfold as a publisher and editor.
Before we move on to Q&A, I might just briefly raise one topic, both a risk and an opportunity, which is that of investigative journalism, which Andrea Carson from the University of Melbourne addressed in a companion to the Australian media. And I'm wondering about how small outlets in particular are attempting to find a financially sustainable model for investigative journalism and the sort of cost they experience along the way. So who would like to go first, Chris or Erik? Erik, perhaps? Or
yeah, I think investigative journalism is expensive insofar as it takes time, but that's not the greatest inhibitor to the publishing of investigative journalism in small publications. I think the greatest threat to investigative journalism in the country, without question, is the Defamation Act, and the fact that it can be used vexatiously against small publishers who seek to publish material that is very often true, but that even defending its truth can send to a wall a publisher that is simply trying to do what all journalists want to do. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more wholeheartedly. I'm dancing a jig internally as you said that. We're in the Supreme Court of New South Wales at the moment defending a story related to the Francis Abbott secret scholarship story that we broke last year. That's been going on for a year, and while we're reasonably confident of winning the case, even if we do, it'll cost us $100,000. We were in the federal court last year defending the Barry Spur matter, which in the end didn't cost us anything, but the time that you invest in defending these things is huge. So by far the biggest threat to us is defamation. Every time we break a big story, a bigger lawyer appears on the horizon with a writ and waving it at us.
And the fix to this is incredibly simple. I mean, if there were a tribunal that publishers and litigants could go to before they'd engaged lawyers and decide on the facts of the story and whether those facts were reasonably contested before anyone had to start paying for lawyers, then I would be much less worried about publishing stories. And I wouldn't do them. I wouldn't publish stories recklessly, but I wouldn't be worried about someone who was rich stopping a story being published simply because they were rich, or just destroying the sort of paper's capacity to continue to function because they were rich, not because the story was in any way an error.
Yeah, and look, the question from Bridget was how do you find a model? I talk about this quite a lot, and there's a guy actually gearing up at the moment to do a documentary on exactly this issue, on New Matilda and whether or not investigative journalism like we do is sustainable. And I'm the owner of it, and I'm not convinced it is. But so if I come to you and ask you to invest, forget what I just said. I don't know if it is sustainable the way we do it. I believe it is. I'm a hopeless optimist trapped in the body of a bit of pessimist about it. But I think it is doable. Again, we've only got to get 10,000 subscribers, and that's $1 million, and we can even pay the legal bills with $1 million. But we'll see. We're doing the month of Mayhem next month. Actually, we'll probably postpone Mayhem to June, ironically, because of resources. But we're trying to break a major investigative piece every week to show people what we could do if we had a subscriber base to properly resource New Matilda. Whether or not that works, who knows? I mean, I guess we'll find out.
Michelle, has the conversation attracted writs?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it's attracted many. There is a very rigorous editing process, I guess, maybe one reason, but also it's not into the sort of investigative journalism that we've just been talking about in the last few minutes, because the writers of the conversation are academics and they're into research, obviously, but they're not into those sorts of investigations. So it's less open to, less vulnerable to writs, I think, than
it's also got a lot more opinion.
Organisations.
It's got a lot more opinion and analysis, which tends to attract less writs, because opinion is a pretty strong defence in a defamation action, as long as it's not opinion parading as fact, which is a reader's comment we're currently defending in the Supreme Court. Right. But
one area of interest, I think, in this whole question of defamation is the comments that come onto sites, which are, I think, across the board, quite feral. Certainly, the comments on my articles make your hair stand up on end sometimes, and I think that the same goes for the Fairfax and news sites. I don't know.
Is Ian Hall here tonight, by any chance? No one knows who Ian Hall is? No, you'll find out sooner or later. Read New Matilda and you'll find out who he is. He's our resident troll.
Right. Do you have these problems? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we pre-moderate all of the comments that come through the site. The tenor of them is actually quite a relief in some respects. It suggests that our readers are not as rabid as might be otherwise. But it's certainly becoming the publisher of your readers is a strange thing for a news organisation to consider.
It's terrifying if you're the owner and you're legally liable for it. Half the action in the Supreme Court is defending a reader's comment. And look, our readers are the smartest, most fabulous people in the world, but some of the people who comment on our articles are some of the most feral individuals God ever put breath into. And
how is this so? I don't really understand how the commenters have become so feral, and as you say, the readers are quite different categories.
Look, New Matilda got a reputation as a prior to me coming, and simply because of resources. It didn't have the resources to police comments. It got a reputation as a we'll publish anything site. No matter what you say, it'll get up on New Matilda. So of course it attracted the people who everybody else punted. And I've recently had to change the commenting policies to prevent conspiracy theory, Holocaust denial, all sorts of ridiculous stuff being debated on our page, regardless of what the story is. And unfortunately, a lot of my time at the moment is taken up with policing the comments and deleting accounts.
Well, some people say if you get in there with a stick early on,
Yeah, I'm doing that
that
now.
you could exert some sort of discipline over the conversation, but who's got the time or energy to
I've got the psychopathic tendencies, I must admit.
Let's
I'm enjoying part of it.
let's leave the conversation there and go to our audience, who hopefully aren't feral, but we have about 10 minutes for questions and comments from the floor. There are roving microphones.
Hi, my name's Susan Durgam. I'm actually an anti-war activist, and I'd like to ask about two veteran investigative journalists, Seymour Hersh and Robert Parry, who've both written about the alleged Ghouta attack in Syria in August 2013, and they both claim that it was most likely that the rebels did it. Is there a market for their reports, or is it just too late, and so we have to continue with the groupthink that the government did it?
I mean, for a publication like the Saturday paper, our focus is overwhelmingly domestic because we think we're offering, a salve to a problem we see in domestic reporting. Sy Hersh, I think, has written about this for The New Yorker. There's certainly, there is always appetite for his reportage. It's just that appetite exists in international magazines in the main. And, getting back to the sort of stuff that Chris was talking about, there is always appetite for the publication of good journalism online. And it doesn't need a publisher per se other than the person posting it.
Yeah, it's something New Matilda might look at. We've got a fairly diverse... We'll take... we are interested in the stories other people won't publish, and that's why we're still alive. So.
Hi. I have an employment history as a trained journalist for the Herald Sun, and then I jumped ship and turned into corporate public relations. So the question that I'm very interested in, because I'm very aware of the slashing and burning of journalist numbers in terms of who can actually pump the stories out, how dependent are journalists now on the public relations industry, corporate communications, people putting out the material for sanitised versions of what's going on in Australia, and at what point are you in a position of finding your own?
I'm both not dependent on it as a journalist and 100% dependent on it as a homeowner. My other job, I don't get paid by New Matilda, so my other job is media spin and political advice, predominantly for Aboriginal organisations. So I kind of cross the fields, but as a journalist, I don't use public relations virtually at all. I might for a soft story about a new book or a new CD, but generally speaking, it's not something we go anywhere near.
Michelle, do you
No offence intended, obviously.
Well, I see a lot of the public relations industry that's political spin, and this has grown to be an enormous industry, and one that I think has made political journalism more of a challenge because ministers, opposition, frontbenchers, even backbenchers on both sides now are so dependent on their media advisors. They hardly move without them, and getting past those advisors, I think, is a challenge for journalists. It's especially a challenge for young journalists coming into political reporting, and it's just a nightmare for everyone in general trying to get past the lines and get past the people to original sources, which is very important for political coverage. I'll just give you one example. I think Bob Menzies had one press secretary. Tony Abbott's got 5.
Yeah, but Tony, that's for a reason. He needs 5.
And that's across the whole of government. There's been an absolute explosion in the spin industry, i.e. the PR industry in government, in politics.
And with the decline in the number of journalists and the rise of copy sharing, it's sort of inevitable that there's more spin, or it's harder to cut through the spin.
Yes, it is.
Interested in the panel's opinion of the Fairfax business model shown in the recent decisions on resourcing of regional papers in Australia, regional media outlets, that they took over independently owned papers over the decades and seem to be intent on destroying them by just simply under-resourcing them.
Yeah, I did 7 years in the bush for Rural Press, who was notorious for under-resourcing and destroying newspapers, but it survived financially as an organisation. I must admit, my plan in life is to retire to a community on the south coast of New South Wales and harass the shit out of the editor, because that's what happened to me when I was an editor. I'm just going to write those angry letters, but I think it's very sad, and I still think there's a place for those papers, because the buying habits in those communities and the community habits in those communities are quite different. But they're not immune to the effects of new media, and I think they will slowly die.
But the truth is that one of the few bits of journalism that won't be replaced by, larger online reporting is
CWA.
Is exactly that kind of local reporting. It's exactly why Warren Buffett is buying up small papers in the States, because they have a direct relationship both with local advertisers and with local readers, and it's something that won't necessarily be overtaken by online reporting unless micro reporting sites set up in those communities, and we've seen no evidence of that.
I think it will. Yeah, I agree. I think it will. The print will die eventually, because the consuming habits are changing as the age demographic changes. But I think there will always be those small papers, but I think they will inevitably go online. They'll have to. At the moment, they're all online, but their focus is still print. But that will change.
What you used to have, of course, was small papers which were essentially small local businesses separately owned. Now you have these papers that part of the main chains run really from a distance. I think I read somewhere recently where 2 or 3 papers in Victoria, the same editor edited these separate papers even though they were a very long way apart. I think they've fundamentally changed, and in a sense that's a pity, because they have less of a community flavour than when they were businesses owned and run by the local.
And I would
locals.
argue that their success is predicated on that community flavour, and when that's lost, that's when the business is imperilled.
That was what you said, Michelle, is exactly my experience. I was the editor of the Batemans Bay Post, the Moruya Southern Star, the Eurobdala Independent and the Narooma News. So Batemans Bay, Moruya and Narooma, 3 towns that hated each other and had in some cases shared copy and one editor. But that was 17 years ago. So these changes have been coming for a long time, unfortunately. And that was Rural Press. I still love the days. The Queenscliff Herald, I believe, is still privately owned. In fact, they're selling their paper at the moment. But we may, look, to be honest, we may see a revival of that one day. It might become trendy. I hope so.
All right, we'll have one last quick question before we wind up.
John Tevitt from Monash University. I was just interested in the fact that in regards to sort of maverick provocative journalism, no one mentioned student press. And one of the areas that was a really important area for that kind of work was student press. But there were really specific policies that were developed that started to undermine the subsidy model that operated in the universities. So I think there's a relationship between changes in policies at that micro level and the kind of journalism we get. So I don't know if anyone wants to reflect on the role of student press, of what it was or what it might be, or the relationship between changes in government policies or institutional policies and that kind of impact on maverick journalism.
I don't know what's happening in student press at the moment, but I do know that some very good journalists have come through student publications, and Laurie Oakes, who edited the Sydney University paper, is just an example that immediately comes to mind. So I think it has been an important recruitment ground, but as I say, I'm not up with it at the moment.
Max Chalmers from New Matilda was the editor of En Histoire, which is the Sydney University paper. I must say I've recently been, you wouldn't even call it verbal, they just made shit up and republished it as a story. It wasn't to attack me, it was just because they thought that's what you could do. And some of the student newspapers do much better than the other, but I see them as a really important alternative voice. And I love, they still believe they can change the world, and there's not many journos about who still embrace that. I'm probably the only one stupid enough to admit it, but...
Well, I'm going to jump in here and say one of the key entries I wanted to commission for this book was an entry on student newspapers, because nothing substantial appears to have been written about them, in spite of the roll call of people who got their start there that Michelle referred to, Donald Horne, Brian Fitzpatrick, Laurie Oakes you referred to, Richard Walsh, Bob Ellis, Clive James. There were some women as well. So it was... I ended up co-authoring the entry with a young former student editor, but there's still a great deal of work to do there. But I'll just say, in answer to John Tebbett, who's a companion contributor, thank you, John, that when VSU was introduced by the Howard government in 2006, student publications were starved of funding from student fees, and that really has had an impact on the vibrancy of the sector. And I'm sorry we may have to end on that rather depressing note, but you can read more about student newspapers in the companion.
In New Matilda, I believe.
And
.com, $90 a year for a subscription.
And yes, so I think we should also, in the interest of supporting independent media, be looking to support Chris in his subscription drive in coming months. So
I'd agree wholeheartedly with that.
Please join me in thanking Chris, Erik and Michelle